I'm Jenna Seery, a bookseller and associate producer of Poured Over, and today I am so excited to have Maggie Smith back on the show. I spoke to you for You Can Make This Place Beautiful, a book that sits with me, I think, every day now in my life, and so I am so excited to be talking about Dear Writer, Pep Talks and Practical Advice for the Creative Life. As soon as I saw the title, I was like, yes, I need this book. I need whatever information can be sort of transported into my brain. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, no, Jenna, it's good to be back. Thank you.
So I'd love to talk a little bit about something I was very curious about as I was reading this book and as I was preparing for this is why you chose to write this book right now, which I think is kind of a loaded question for any author, but
yeah,
writing a craft book is a big deal.
It is a big deal. It's something, I love a craft book. I have a whole shelf in the office I'm in right now that's completely dedicated to craft books that I have read, learned from, taught from, recommended, obsessed over, revisited when I'm feeling stuck. I don't think we ever outgrow the need to go and sort of dip back into these kind of foundational texts in our lives and see what they might offer to us at different stages in our writing lives. Dear Writer, actually, the sort of secret of this book is that I wrote it, the first draft of this book, and turned it in before I wrote my memoir.
Ooh.
So after Keep Moving, this was the next book that I was working on. And so I drafted it. I had it turned in. I didn't think I was going to write a memoir, so it had a lot more kind of personal information in that draft of the book. And then when I decided to write the memoir, we kind of pressed pause on this book, and it was all hands on deck for the memoir. And once we had cleared the hardcover and the paperback for that book, I went back to this draft. And I did something unexpected, which is I completely rewrote the book. And that is maybe an unusual thing to do. But I looked at the draft and I was like, oh no, now that the memoir lives in the world, I can approach this in a different way. And I'm also like a couple years older and a couple years wiser. And I've read several more craft books in the interim. And I think my approach to this, I would like it to be very different. And so this book is structured around these 10 sort of what I see as 10 essential elements of creativity. Like if you made creativity a recipe, these would be my 10 ingredients. Someone else would come up with different ingredients. And those were not part of the original draft. So that was the big idea in the rewrite, was coming up with a new organizing principle. And then I was off and running.
I love the idea of returning to craft books, especially. I feel like there are so many books that I've read at different points where, reading it at one time, I picked up certain things or certain things really connected, and then coming back later, something entirely different. I still think about the first time I was probably, I don't know, maybe in high school, and I read On Writing by Stephen King.
Yes.
And I still think about, he writes about like shoving a pencil in his ear, and like that will never be out of my mind.
Yeah, I believe I received Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird as a gift, I think when I graduated from high school. I don't think it was college. I think it was high school, because I was already kind of identifying myself as a poet at that point. And that book is more geared toward prose, but it was, I could feel the human being behind it. And so for me, that was one of sort of my inspiration texts. Like, I love a craft book that doesn't feel academic. I love a craft book that is not dry, that is really for the layperson. Like, maybe you're already doing the thing and you can get something out of it, or maybe you're not doing the thing yet. And this might be a way to kind of onboard yourself, and being able to sense like a fallible, curious, messy, emotional human being behind the text made me trust the advice more. Because I just thought, like, oh, this person isn't like sitting like some oracle on high. They're down here with us, rolling their sleeves up, getting the work done. And some days go better than others. And I think that kind of gave me the permission to really do that in Dear Writer. And I think it sounds like me talking for a lot of the book.
I agree. I mean, I remember also reading Bird by Bird, and that was one of the first times I was like, oh, you can admit you're wrong in a book, or you can admit that you've made mistakes, or that you did something and it didn't work, and now what about this? Or maybe even to say, I actually don't have that part figured out yet, so let's work on that together, or let me know if you figure it out.
Right. Like sometimes the true answer, and I know this as a writer and as a teacher and as a parent, sometimes the most authentic answer to a question is, I don't know.
Especially in writing, when what works for you may not make sense to someone else.
Correct.
And I think I love any book that sort of settles on this like guiding principle of just letting yourself create. That is so much of the basis of it. Is you don't need to do anything other than just let yourself be creative.
Yeah, writer's right. You don't, do you need to have an MFA? No. Do you need to have published a bunch of work? No. I mean, what you need to be a writer is actually like, it's for me, I think I loved it growing up. It's like the most affordable thing you can possibly do, right? A legal pad, a pen, the notes app on the phone that you already have with you all the time and cannot put down despite the fact that you'd love to. And even when I don't have those sort of implements with me, I have my mind, right? Like you can go on a walk as a writer, and even if you don't have a way to record what you're thinking, thank goodness you have your mind and you have your senses, and you can be sort of imprinting all those things on yourself and squirreling them home so you can write them down when you do have those implements.
And being open to ideas and being open to the world around you, that's free, actually. So you can do that at any time. And I know that it's easy to be like cavalier about it, because I know there's so many things in our lives that like prevent us from doing that, and that are like actively pushing against us being able to be open and be ready. But I mean, if you have a line that's like, you can't force a poem, but you can be open to it. And I know that is something that I learned also from like Elizabeth Gilbert in her works, and just that ability to be open.
Yeah. And I think it's essential not just for creating things, but just for living. The world will feed you so much static all day long. I mean, it really is. If you think about sort of what your mind is sort of subjected to on a daily basis, it's like tuning a radio to a lot of different stations all at one time. And no wonder it sounds garbled, and it's hard to kind of find what you're supposed to be doing or supposed to be listening to or supposed to be focusing on. And so much of both creating and also just living in a way that feels humane and manageable is learning to sort of dial down that static, or dial to a different kind of frequency in your brain to get to that quieter inner space where you can come up with an idea, have some discernment about an issue that you're facing in your life. I mean, all of those things are not really conducive to the everything all at onceness of the way we live in these times. And so learning to kind of quiet the mind, even if it's just for half an hour, to take a walk and come back and journal, or even if it's just to open an old draft. There are days I don't feel particularly inspired, and I try not to beat myself up about it. I don't need to be composing new poems every day. Let's not be heroes. It's fine. But I could do something in service of my writing life every day. Sometimes that is taking a walk, right? Taking care of your human self is taking care of the writer inside you. So if what that means is having lunch with a friend, then you're taking care of the writer inside you, if that's what you need on that day. But maybe it's going back to an old problem child of a draft that you haven't known what to do with, and just opening it fresh on a different day and seeing if something might click, or submitting some poems that you think are done, or a story that you think is probably done, or doing a little research for a longer piece. There are lots of things we can do in service of our creativity that don't involve squeezing blood from a stone every single day.
And I think that when you are wanting to be creative, when you're wanting to write or create, do any kind of art, and, it's human nature that we go and seek out, what are other people saying about this? And so often I am baffled by sort of the like stock responses of like really regimented things. And I know that that works for some people, or at least I am led to believe that that works for some people.
Right.
But I think especially now when our lives have to be everything. No one can be one thing. No one can live in one box. I think especially for women or for any marginalized identity, the idea of being able to regiment your work, your creativity is just not something that's viable anymore.
Yeah, I envy people who have a more regimented, like, I don't want to say a more committed way of writing, because I think I'm very committed to my writing, but I don't sit down at the same time every day in the same place and bang out the same number of words every day. And I know people who do that and it works for them. And I think again, like you were saying earlier, none of this is one size fits all. No piece of advice applies to everyone. For me, particularly raising kids, being a single parent, being self-employed, having a lot of stuff going on, it is not, if I tried to do it that way, I would probably just end up beating myself up about not doing it that way, because it wouldn't work out every day. And then I'd get called to do this, or I'd have to go do this, and I'd think, oh, that was my writing time. And so setting it up that way for me doesn't really work. And part of what I wanted to do with Dear Writer is just give other people permission to find their own path. It may look something like mine. It may look nothing like mine. It really doesn't matter how you get there, as long as you get there. And if it means writing on Post-it notes while you're cooking dinner for your family, if it means scribbling things out in the middle of the night because you can't sleep, if it means only working when your children nap, if it means working a lot in airports because you have a really demanding career, but for some reason, when you're on a plane and nobody can get you via email, you just can write or read for 2 hours. I mean, whatever it looks like, I think the most important thing is showing up for yourself and finding a way to make it happen without guilt or shame about the ways it's not happening.
And being open, I think, too, to it may never come exactly like you expect it to, or what you write may not be what you expect. I really loved it in this book. I mean, obviously you are a poet and that is what we know so much from you, but you have written many genres, from memoir to children's books. And I think that reflects in this as well, that genre isn't maybe all it's cracked up to be. And I love that. That's something I'm like, the older I get and the more like immersed in this world, I'm like, I don't know if genre is real anymore.
I know. I'm like, time's a construct, so is genre. Like, I think genre is really useful for some people.
For Barnes and Noble to sell books.
Exactly. Like, Barnes and Noble need genre because you need to know where to put the books, and people need to know where to find them. Librarians, we need genre. Like, we need to know, again, where to put the books. If you're going to market a book, it's helpful to know what to call it and what it is, so you can find the people who like that sort of thing. I actually think, though, to make things, you don't need to know what box it's going to go in later or what people will call it later necessarily. I mean, when I'm making something, I'm not thinking, oh, you have to be X or you have to be Y. It's like raising a child. Like, I don't get to choose. I don't get to choose who you are, how you dress, what you're good at, what your strengths and weaknesses are, what your personality ends up being. That's nothing to do with, like, frankly, I helped facilitate you coming into the world. And now my job is to sort of be a good steward of you and make sure that you get to do all the things that you want to do and to basically get out of your way. And it's not that different with creating not a human, but writing a piece of artwork. It's like, I facilitated you coming into the world. I am now a steward. It is my job to shepherd you through, to help you get to as many people as you can get to help you be the best you can be, and to get out of your way. And not to think I know best necessarily about what you should look like or sound like or how you should move in the world, because you probably have your own ideas about that.
Also, I mean, when I look at some of my favorite pieces of art, my favorite novels, poems, so often when the author talks about them, they're like, I had no idea this was going to be the one that X, the one that I know you have experience with that as well, not knowing that anything you create could be the one that is different, even on a small scale, the one that all your friends love or the one that
Right.
you really love. You never know when you start which one that's going to be.
No, you really don't. I mean, I actually wrote about this in Dear Writer about the fact that if I had known that my poem Good Bones would have gone viral and would have, been in Meryl Streep's mouth, I never would have finished that poem. It never would have been in my mind ready for what it was heading for, right? But because I didn't know the life it would get to have, I just got to write it as a poem and let it do its thing. And then as soon as I was mostly satisfied with it, I kicked it out of the nest and started making other things. And I do think, one of the things that we can do that can really paralyze us in the creative process is getting too hung up on the what next. And, oh, well, are people going to like it? Are they going to get it? What are there going to be 1-star reviews or 5-star reviews? Will anyone even clock this, or will it just be crickets? I mean, really thinking about and having expectations for something that you're making while you're making it sort of poisons the well, I think. And so trying to keep that sort of like yourself in that little bubble, that little snow globe while you're creating, and not letting the world get at you too much, or the future expectations for that thing get at you too much, I think is so important. Like keeping that little spell of making alive for as long as possible. Because once you start thinking about how a thing's going to fare in the world, that spell is broken. And you can't really get back into that headspace once you're out of it.
Yeah, one of my favorite sections in Dear Writer is the section on tenacity. I loved that because I think it just, in this world now where everything has a value judgment and everything has everyone has a million voices that they can reach out to and connect to at any moment.
Yeah.
It is so hard to keep that momentum of creating something that is for you and to really just do it for the love of doing it and doing it for yourself and for the service of the art you're creating.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I joke sometimes. I'm like, don't tell anyone, but I would be doing this for free. Because, I mean, I think every artist is like that. Like, none of us got into this to make a living or because we thought we would make money doing it, right?
Yes.
Like every musician I know, every photographer I know, every painter I know, every poet I know, we do this because we can't not do it. And if we were spending, 80 hours a week working 4 jobs doing something else, we'd still be using the scraps of time that we had to be making these things. That's the way that it works. And so, yeah, it's the tenacity thing is key. A lot of times, I mean, I tell students, if I have to boil it down, it's like tenacity and patience is those two things go hand in hand. And really, if you don't have those two things, you probably are in the wrong line of work. If you want to be an artist of some kind, you're playing the long game. Every overnight success I know, I'm using air quotes, every overnight success I know worked for many years to become that overnight success. Everybody has more no's under their belt than yeses. I talk about the shadow CV, which is like if your resume is the list of yeses, your shadow CV is the list of no's that nobody knows about. And it's many, many pages longer than your list of yeses. And it's in the dark, right? Nobody talks or publishes their long list of fellowships they didn't get, and publishers that rejected them, and magazines that didn't want to publish their stuff, and galleries that didn't want to show their work. But if we all are a little bit more transparent, I think, about how many no's sometimes it takes to get to those critical yeses, maybe we'd all be a little less discouraged in this process.
It feels so easy to be like, yes, just write, just do it. And it's like, we can all recognize that actually that's the hardest thing to do. It is so vulnerable. It is so daunting to say, okay, I'm going to write this thing. And if I'm really writing something from myself that feels like this is a part of me, and then to put that out there is a lot. I mean, we talked a lot about vulnerability with your memoir, because obviously that is a huge piece of that story, is you really putting yourself out there. But in a lot of ways, anything we write is putting ourselves out there. Even writing a craft book, you're putting a lot of yourself and how you work and how you think out there to be consumed.
Right. And therefore critiqued, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, anytime we do anything, we're putting ourselves out there to be critiqued. It's like I put on a Song Zahaya t-shirt with a giant wool cardigan today, and I'm sure someone's like, does she think that's an outfit? You know, anything we do, any haircut we have, I mean, honestly, anything we do is putting us in a position to be either accepted or rejected by others. And writing, I think, feels particularly vulnerable because we're taking things from our souls, really, like our hearts and minds, and putting it out there to be consumed, critiqued, rejected, accepted, loved, hated. And again, I still think the best method is make and move on, and not make and then let the thing go and then get out your sort of like mind's binoculars to watch it travel far distances into the world and try to get the look on everyone's face as they open it to see and eavesdrop to hear what they're saying. That's a really dangerous headspace to be in. But if you can refocus your energy after making something, when you have that kind of vulnerability hangover of like, oof, like I just gave a lot of myself, whether it's from my teaching self or my personal self or whatever that is. I just gave a lot of myself. And if people don't like it, it's going to feel like they don't like me. A, that's not true. But B, it might be hard for you to separate that out. And the best way to separate that out, I think, is to not be listening and looking so much. And to just get back to making the next thing and kind of busying your mind in that way. And the bonus of that is that you get to make more things. And you're not paralyzed by the what ifs of the last thing that keeps you maybe sidelined for a while if you feel disappointed by its reception or, you know, whatever the case may be.
I think we've all had those moments where we're like 3/4 of the way asleep and your eyes open and you're like, remember when I've submitted that, or remember when I've done that? And you just have to like keep pushing through that and keep going, because our brains do hold on to those things that sometimes we wish they wouldn't. But I think, like you said, being able to just keep creating and to keep using the other parts that are sort of comforting that scared, that vulnerable part, it just moves in a cycle.
Oh, 100%. I mean, there's a reason why there's like a whole section in this book on like quieting and talking back to the inner critic. Because that little voice that we have in our heads that should be kind because it lives in our heads. I'm like, how do you have the nerve to live rent-free in there and be such a jerk? It just seems unkind. But yeah, I think it's funny, for as much as we talk about how vulnerable it feels to have other people read and critique our work, I actually think the most dangerous naysayer is the one we carry with us all the time and can't get away with, because it's the naysayer that lives inside us and tells us like, oh my gosh, you should just stop writing that. It's not going to be any good. Or what business do you have writing outside of your home genre? Or nobody's going to want this. Or this is structured in such a weird way. Why would you choose to do things this way? Or, you know, whatever the case, or your last book didn't do that well. Why are you trying this again? Or your last book did great. You're never going to top it. It doesn't matter, really, where you're at in your career or your life. That voice is always going to say the most undermining things, and 99.9% of the time, it's lying to you. And so I definitely wanted to address in this book like ways to sort of work around that and to turn that voice down and tune in instead to some kinder frequencies that we also carry around in ourselves.
And a section that feels like that for me is when you talk about play in this book and you talk about sort of that feeling that you can get, because one of my favorite things is picking up a piece of writing, doesn't matter what it is. And even if it's like sad and depressing and or angry or scary, when you can still tell when an author is playing when they write, and it has just a shine all its own.
Oh, I love that. I love that way you phrase that. I think you're right. I mean, it's funny. People will sometimes say, "Oh, I bet writing that memoir was really hard and sad." And it's odd. Yeah, I mean, some days were harder than others, but for the most part, I find writing even about really difficult things pretty pleasurable because there's creative problem solving to it. And I'm also giving something difficult a form. And so that, I mean, the creative process feels good even when you're applying it to maybe aspects of your life that didn't feel so good to experience, right? And so it actually doesn't matter. You're right. Like in a book that is scary or dark or sad, I love that you can sort of sense the writer having a good time, right? And having, I mean, fun feels like a weird word. When I tell people I had fun writing my memoir, they're like, "Have you read that book?"
They're like, "Are you actually, maybe we're not as good as you thought."
Are you okay? And I'm like, okay, maybe fun is not quite the word.
Yeah.
But pleasure. I think I experience pleasure when writing that book because coming up with solutions, craft solutions to problems in your writing is pleasurable. And maybe even the word that it is more, it's satisfying.
Mm-hmm.
To just sort of confront something and be able to sort of resolve it and find a way around it or find a way to articulate it in a really satisfying way on the page. And I hope that does come through to readers.
I still picture when I read your memoir, you with like different colored markers and you're, crafting that book and creating that book. And I can really sense a similar feeling in Dear Writer that all of the sections, the subsections under the bigger pieces, they are very lovingly placed. Everything has a connection, everything flows. And I think that is something that even though you're not explicitly talking about that all the time, having those craft books that are so well thought out, it's teaching you things without saying it.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad that was your experience of the book because I definitely spent a lot of time mapping it out, which is not normally how I work. I usually work in a very by the seat of my pants kind of way, but this isn't that kind of book. So I knew I actually did have an outline and I knew where I wanted everything to go. And then I thought, well, should this go more under this? Or is this more surprise or play? Is this more tenacity or and so it was a kind of fun, creative problem solving for me, even to come up with where would an essay about this go? Where would this writing prompt work best? Where would this list for further reading references work best? The sort of Tetrising together of this book was fun for me.
I also love the prompts and the reading list. I'm glad that you brought this up because I think that's something that isn't always included in craft books. It's something, I think there are often further readings or, obviously authors mentioned their influences, but I love the way you divided it and had them in each section because I do think this is a book that people will come and I hope, read the whole thing straight through, but it's so easy to just dip back in and be like, I need a little help on this today. And to just go in and be able to pick out the pieces that you need in the moment are really great.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I feel like the mark of a good craft book is actually you might not get through it all in the first sitting because something that the writer says or offers to you will make you want to put it down and grab a pen. And so my hope is that people will have a hard time reading it in one sitting and that they will be inspired to get pulled and sort of sucked out of it into their own creative practice, maybe by those prompts that come up at the end of each section or even just something, a strategy like, oh, have you ever tried this? Oh, I hadn't. And I have this piece of writing that I think this would work really well on. I'm going to dog ear this page and I'll come back to it later because it's not going anywhere. And I'm feeling inspired to dig into this piece of writing of my own. That would honestly, I feel like the successful craft book is like one that takes people a really long time to get through because they're constantly dipping out of it.
I changed a sentence in a draft I've had for probably like 4 years that I've been cracking away at based on this book. So I just
Oh my gosh. Okay. That needs to be like a blurb on the paperback. That's it. Write that down.
Okay. Because it is the kind of that hallmark of you have to be thinking about those things all the time. Like, I know that as I was going through, just getting those pieces of like, I probably thought that about this myself, but sometimes you just need someone else saying something to you to internalize it.
100%. And that goes for everything. It's anything. It always helps to have somebody sort of validating and confirming what you already think. And then you're like, okay, yeah, that's probably a thing. I should go ahead and do that. Isn't it funny how we need those like little cheerleaders beside us being like, no, that's real. You should probably pay attention to that. I'm happy to facilitate that for you.
Thank you. I think it does go too that we read and write to be changed, right? You know, like none of us want a static experience coming. I don't want to read a book and be the same on the other end of it. I don't want to write something and be the same on the other end of it. And that really like comes through in this book, this idea that we are changing and growing and doing all the time.
Yeah, you can't. I mean, that's the thing. Even if you wanted to be the same when you opened a book and then when you closed it at the end, you don't get to be. Just like even this conversation, we won't be the same at the end of it. Every experience that we have, every conversation, every experience we have with art, it doesn't matter if it's listening to a song or seeing a movie or reading a book or writing a poem, whether we're making the art or consuming it, it changes us. I find that so exciting. And for me, it's like the thing that keeps me in it. Like, I don't write poems because they comfort me. I don't read poems because they comfort me. I write and read to be changed and to be surprised. And I never know whether I'm the writer or the reader. I never know in what ways I will be changed and what ways I will be surprised. You know, these pieces of writing pop up and they have their own agenda. They have their own flavor, their own tone, their own timing. I never know what these things are doing. And if I were more of a control freak, I suppose that would really stress me out. But for the most part, I find it delightful that these things show up and they come kind of from me. And yet I don't even feel like I can fully claim them. Again, it is the metaphor of the child, I think, is really apt because I feel like, well, I can't really claim you because I can't throw a baseball like that. So I don't know where that came from, or I can't do that, or that's not, you're not able to do that because of me. And I feel that way about anything I've ever made. It's somehow of me and not of me. And I find that even as a reader, after I've written something and I go back and read it again, I'm like, oh, I'm seeing new things. That probably happens to you too. It never stops showing me new things. For me, it's like one of the most beautiful gifts of art is that it's like soil that's constantly being tilled. And we never know everything that's in there. It's just every time we get to revisit it, it's something completely new.
And I think, too, reading books on craft changes how I read other things.
Oh, sure.
Because I'm not someone who has a degree or like much official schooling in creative writing. So everything I've learned has just been sort of through reading it. And I think that that's so true for so many people that
Yes.
Most people have never taken a class on poetry or know how form works, know the rules of certain poems, how they all fit together. So taking the chance to read something and be like, oh, that's why that looks like that. That's why that feels like that. It just opens new doors.
I love that. I hope that that's people's experience, especially with the poetry examples in this book, because of all the genres, at least in my experience, poetry is the thing that people are most scared of. I almost said intimidated by, but I actually think scared is the right word. I know people who read constantly, and they'll still say things like, "Yeah, but I don't really get poetry, or I'm not a poetry person." And I'm always like, "Okay, but what if we could just sit down and look at this poem and like talk about it like two human beings, and you're not going to have to take a test and no one's going to ask you what it means and you don't have to explicate it. Like, what if we could take it out of that scary kind of academic setting, which is probably where this fear originated, because someone showed you a poem in 10th grade and asked you to explain it.
Right.
And you had a hard time doing that. And frankly, if someone handed me a poem right now and said, what does it mean? I would have a hard time telling you. And this is what I've been doing for the last 30 some years of my life. So being able to just engage with things and sort of glean pleasures from them, talk about what you notice, talk about like what it makes you think about or remember from your own life, and being able to enjoy art outside of a sort of an academic setting, frankly, I find that incredibly powerful. And I hope there are people who maybe don't have that academic background in poetry who will pick up Dear Writer and be like, oh, she's just talking to us like a person and showing us like, this is why this is built this way. And this is why I chose to break this line here. And this is why this word got changed in the next draft to this word, because it sounds better with the word next to it. So that when they read the next poem they come across in a book or on Instagram or wherever, they'll be reading through that lens and might be able to kind of think a little differently about the author's choices without breaking a sweat.
Yeah. I love that you include in the book examples of like your longhand by hand written notes and how that came into a final draft, because I think that is really important for people, both writers and readers, to understand like, oh, this is actually how it works. This is what it looks like in the creative process. It's not just like you sit down and go, and I've written it and it's done.
Imagine if I could just beam a poem straight out of my brain onto a piece of paper. Yeah, it was really important to me. I asked, I was like, is it okay if we scan a spread of one of my writing notebooks and put my crazy, messy, handwritten initial notes?
You have great handwriting. I'm putting that out there.
Thank you. I mean, it's a little weird, but I was like, could we do that? Because it felt important to me to show truly what a disorganized, haphazard, I mean, really trying to build something from scraps, mess. And that's not even a first draft. It's just like, oh, I got an idea and I wrote a few things down. Because it's important for me that people realize that that never goes away. Like, it's not that when I was 16 and first writing poems, they started out really messy, but now, 32 years later, I can sit down and write a poem and it just comes out fully formed and the line breaks are just imprinted in my brain. No, every poem I write since I was a teenager starts out as a bunch of gibberish and random images and metaphors, and then I have to kind of do the work of unpacking all of that and seeing what I have and seeing what's worth keeping and what's maybe junked or what's going to be saved for some other project but isn't going to make it into this poem. And no amount of experience or success exempts you from that messy creative process. I think that is, if there's like one of several takeaways from the book, it's that, which is it doesn't matter if you're writing your first poem or your 1,000th, poem 1,111, you're probably still starting out with a bunch of disorganized imagery and ideas and scraps of language and having to do the same thing that you've always done. And I don't know if that's good news or bad news for people, but for me, it's actually really comforting. Like, I like that my creative process feels exactly the same to me as it did when I was a teenager. Most other things feel completely different, and that is a mercy. But the creative process is the creative process. And there's no way to sort of bypass it and be like, well, I'm a grown-up now. I shouldn't have to wade through all this uncertainty. I'm sorry, friends. That's just life.
Yeah, I love the idea that no matter how you want to approach it or think that you should or hope that it would work, what we get is what we get. And that's not a bad thing. It's not a negative. It's not enough. It's actually, most of us, all of us really have everything we need already to create,
Yep.
to be creative. Even if it's not writing, even if it's just in your accounting job, I bet there's a way that you are creative and that you create something from yourself.
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's so funny. I meet people all the time who are like, oh, it's so interesting that you're so creative. I'm not creative at all. And I'm like, well, that's a lie. I mean, every conversation you have is creative. Every time you have to brainstorm something, solve a problem, come up with a new solution, figure out how to be 5 different places at once as one human being, which we all have to do, everything we do is creative. Like, just even if you're not making art, that doesn't mean you're not a creative person. You know, one of the big principles of this book is that creativity is our birthright. Like, we all have it, we all get it. We can choose to lean into it more or sort of like let it take a back seat and not really claim it as part of our identity. That's fine. I don't think everybody needs to be an artist. I mean, would the world be a better place if everyone were an artist? Look around. My answer is yes. We need more of that. But yeah, I think my hope is that this book is an invitation not just for people who already consider themselves creative, but maybe as a sneaky little invitation to those of us who maybe don't think that we are and are just wrong.
Yeah. I think that, there's so much in all of us that, especially now when things are hard and things are scary, that anything that can bring you joy is the most important. And I think for so many people, there's nothing that brings more joy than creating and being creative.
Absolutely. And if you feel like you're intimidated by creating, then you can enjoy the art that someone else has made. And I do think, I mean, for people who think, well, I'm probably not going to write or paint or take pictures. Like I don't want to make those things. But I do love reading and listening to music and watching films and looking at art. I think reading craft books like Dear Writer will actually help you get more out of the art you consume, right? More out of the art you engage with and spend time with, because it might help you understand it a little better or see it in a different way. So I'm not going to bully everyone into making things, but I think we can think better about the things that other people make too. That's not nothing.
I agree. And I think maybe if you get really into looking at art, you might want to make it. But
I agree. I think most people, for me, reading and listening to music were the gateways to writing. Mm-hmm. And I think it's that way for most people, right? Most people who sit down to start learning guitar, it's because they're listening to a lot of music and they love it and it brings them joy and they want to be part of it. So if you love reading, I think it is a natural next step to be like, but I have stories because we all do. But I have observations because we all do. But I have ideas. I had an idea for a novel once. I had an idea for a short story. And maybe we just need a little bit of permission and like lowering the stakes to be like, it doesn't have to be your job. And frankly, you also don't even have to show anyone.
Yeah.
You don't. Like, you could really just do it for you and it's worth it.
It could live in your drawer forever. It could live on your computer forever. That's okay. But if there's any spark, it's like, oh, just go for it.
Go for it. I love that.
Yes. And speaking of reading and writing and consuming art, you talk a lot about some of your big influences and people you love in Dear Writer. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of those people today.
Yeah, I was going to say, I have a library cart that sits next to my desk that I keep a lot of sort of like favorite current books on, just so they're very close at hand. So I have some of my favorite craft books that are sitting on the shelf right here. So I can tell you some of them. Well, Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird is here. Stephen King's On Writing is here. The Art of Memoir by Mary Karr. Refuse to Be Done by Matt Bell, which is a favorite. Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert, who provided the first beautiful blurb endorsement for Dear Writer, which meant the world. Why Poetry by Matthew Zapruder is up here. And the other one that I really love, and I wouldn't call this a craft book, but it is a book about the role of poetry in our lives. It's called The Wonder Paradox. Do you know this book? It's Jennifer Michael Hecht,
Okay.
Wonder Paradox. It came out in 23, and the subtitle is Embracing the Weirdness of Existence and the Poetry of Our Lives.
Ooh, I like that.
I'm sorry, but like we need a book like that. So yeah, I'm constantly reading. I'm a magpie in that way, always looking for little shiny things just to take back to my own nest, and it helps feed my own work.
Absolutely. I love that. And there are so many, I feel like I've added like 40 books to my TBR and poems and things from dear writers. So
oh, good. Excellent.
I wonder, to sort of end things out, something I was wondering as I was reading this is there anything that really surprised you while you were writing, or something that really changed or was interesting in your perspective that you didn't anticipate as you were writing out this process for yourself?
I think, well, I mean, the big surprise was that I rewrote the book.
Yeah, well, that's a big one. That's a big one.
The big surprise for me is that when I went back to the first draft, I was like, oh no, this isn't the book that I wanted to write. I want to write a very different book. And I guess maybe it's sort of what I've just been talking about, which is I could have been like, well, no, this book is already written, so we're just going to go forward with this version, and it's fine, and it's done, so we should just do this. And instead I thought, well, no, let's make life a lot harder for the next year. And while I'm doing these other projects I've already committed to, thinking this was done, let's completely reinvent the wheel, because I think I can make it something that I'll be prouder of. And again, it's the creative process that surprises you, right? Like, I come to be surprised, I come to be changed. And I had to, if I'm going to sort of walk the walk and not just talk the talk, I had to sort of listen to that voice that said, this isn't the thing. You have something else in you, and you're probably going to need to roll up your sleeves and lose a little sleep to get it done, but it's worth it. So maybe let that be permission for somebody who's like, I made this thing and it's done, but I feel like I could do something else with it. But it's like, do I really want to open up that can of worms? Yeah, maybe you do. Because the other surprise was I had so much fun writing the new version of this book that I now can't imagine the other version living in the world. And I feel really good that I rolled up the sleeves and lost the sleep.
I have to agree. I'm very glad that this book is in the world. I think it was very worth it. So thank you so much for talking with me today about all these wonderful things. Dear Writer is out now, but also please pick up You Could Make This Place Beautiful and Good Bones, because they are magical as well. So thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, no, thanks. Always a pleasure.
Hello, readers. It's time for another TBR Top Off. We're going to recommend a couple of wonderful books to pick up when you stop in for your copy of the fantastic Dear Writer by Maggie Smith. I'm Mark at my Barnes & Noble in Cincinnati, but I'm going to have my book buddy Donald in Detroit kick us off. Donald, hello. What do you got for us?
Hi, Mark. First of all, I want to say Maggie Smith writing a book on writing, and I don't even know, that's the best news ever for anybody interested in writing, interested in telling your own story. But for the purposes of our TBR Top Off, there was clearly one other book that I share with everybody when it comes to how do you learn how to write, how do you pull from your own experiences, your own life, your own story, which is a big thing nowadays, really being able to own and tell your story. And that's Bird by Anne Lamott. This is a classic in the reference writing section, but it is so much more than that. It isn't something you'd come in and pick up and go, okay, I'm going to have to sit there and look at this one day and learn something. It's really about understanding your emotions, understanding where you come from, understanding techniques around how to tell your story. And you do it bird by bird, which is essentially piece by piece, subject by subject, line by line, word by word, right? It is such a simple message and such a simple story that she weaves with things about her family, her father, where she grew up. And you organically just learn through reading this narrative / reference tool to learn how to adapt that to whether you're going to write something about, your own family, nonfiction, if you want to try your hand at fiction, poetry, whatever that is. This translates to all of those writing forms in the simplest, most superb way that is so organic and so lovely that you'll end it feeling like you read like an actual book, like not something you had to learn from. You'll come away going, wow, that was so much more than I ever thought it was. I'm sure Maggie Smith's book is awesome as that, but this was Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott. Mark, what do you have to recommend for us?
Bird by Bird is so good. I'm always excited when a fantastic writer puts out a book about craft. I think Maggie Smith is so well poised to do this. It just feels exactly right. But it made me think of another, like, kind of, I would say, classic or essential book on writing, and that's Natalie Goldberg's Writing Down the Bones. Oh my God, I love this book so much. It is a thoughtful and practical guide for anybody who wants to write. I think Goldberg really shows that playing with the rules of craft can produce some of the most beautiful work. I think the sentences in this tome really showcase her knowledge of that craft, but she also marries it with her creative mind. And I just think that this book is so perfect in that it whispers and it shouts and it sings. It allows a budding writer to understand craft just with the sentences that she writes. It also helps that she has very handy activities for practice and concepts for contemplation. There is a very real sense that you can understand that she is an experienced poet, an author, and a teacher. She has been teaching workshops on writing for a very long time. There's just a gentleness here in the writing and almost a permission slip, but it is really structured with a very steely confidence. I think that it's, I would say, one of my favorite books that we carry in the store, at least in the top 10, that I always want to make sure is faced out for people to see, that I can easily hand sell it to a customer. I just think it's very special because it can apply to anybody in whatever realm of writing they want to experience, or even really just being a creative person. It's wonderful. So check out Writing Down the Bones by Natalie Goldberg. But guess what? That's all the time we have for today. Thanks so much for tuning in to Poured Over. Please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. You can also follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. Pretty simple. I'm Mark. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester. All right, thanks for tuning in, everybody. Happy reading. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.